Oh, the shark, babe, has such teeth, dear, and it shows them pearly white.
Sweet.
Just a jackknife has old man Heath.
In this video, I'm making a knife and then melting down the parts of an old aluminum macpro to make the handles. The first step was to find a comfortable profile I made from plywood to see how it felt in my hand. Next was to use some 1084 high carbon steel that I purchased online. I took the wooden knife profile and used that as a template to draw onto the steel. Once drawn, I needed something to cut the steel with. This metal cutting bandsaw should do the trick. Now it was time to cut it out. I definitely prefer using a bandsaw over an angle grinder when it comes to cutting steel. There's no sparks and no risk of a disc exploding and ruining your day. So now that the knife is roughed out and it feels good in the hand, it's onto the grinder to clean it up. On the grinder, I'm using a 60 grit belt to round off any of the sharp cuts that came from the bandsaw. I couldn't sand out the finger groove with the grinder, so it's onto the spindle sander to smooth it out. The spindle sander makes quick work on any round areas on the blade. Just a heads up, because of the speed and the material you're grinding, you're gonna go through a lot of sandpaper. Well, that didn't work. Now that I give it a test feel in the hand, and I'm digging how it feels powerful. Now it's time to put the main bevel on the blade. Some people freehand their bevels, I don't. I use a bevel jig that I made. Get over it, knife nerds. Now that I've ground down the knife about 90% to completion, I'm pretty happy on how everything's turned out so far. Now it's time to drill the holes for the pins that will hold the handles. Or scales, as the knife nerds call them. Alright, the blade has been shaped, the bevels have been ground, and the holes have been drilled. It's time for fire.
Cool. Fire, 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 fire.
So here I get the blade hot enough so it's glowing and no longer magnetic. Once it's at that point, I quench it in corn oil. I use a steel brush to clean off any scaling that may have happened during the heating process, and then I check if a file skates off the edge of the blade. At this point, the blade is just too brittle, so I have to temper it and make it a bit softer but still be able to hold an edge. So it goes into the oven for 2 cycles at 400 degrees for 2 hours at a time. Now that it's tempered, it's time to clean the blade up with some higher grit belts. I first clean up the flat side of the blade by holding it with a powerful magnet against the grinder. At this point, I can clean up all the other sides of the knife as well. Next, it's time to sand the bevels clean. So I throw it back on the knife jig, and I use a 3M Trizac belt for a nice shiny finish. And now it's time for the fun part. I ended up picking the cover as it'll be the easiest to cut in my bandsaw. Before I started cutting, I needed to remove the screws and molding that ran on the inside of the cover. I kept the screws and I wanted to include them in the handle somehow, and I'll show you how I did that in the next step. It's time for the bandsaw again. Let's get cutting. I cut the case into small square pieces so that they'll easily fit in my crucible and melt faster than larger pieces. At this point, I still have no idea if this is gonna work. I then used some casting sand and made a small rectangular mold out of some old 2x4s I had laying around the shop. I dumped the sand in and pushed down the mold of a knife scale I made out of plywood. I drilled 2 screws on the top of the mold so I could remove it much more easily. Well, that's definitely a rectangle. Looks good to me. I then set up the crucible on some fire bricks just to be safe. Double check my blowtorch, put my safety glasses on, and finally some gloves. You gotta always be safe when you're dealing with fire. Once the torch was going, I would put in 1 piece of aluminum at a time until it was melted. I would then repeat the steps until I thought I had enough to fill the whole scale mold. For those asking, I used a piece of stainless steel rod to stir the molten aluminum to make sure it was ready to pour.
What the hell does that mean?
Liquid metal.
Now it was time to pour. I underestimated how much metal I would need, so I had to pour quick and use the rod to spread the aluminum to fill the mold. Once it was poured, I let it cool down before I grabbed it with the pliers. It looks like they came out pretty good so far. Now let's take these over to the knife grinder to square them up and flatten them out. Like I said, now it's time to flatten the sides that the knife will be attached to and try to square them up so it's easier to grind. Now that I have one side of each scale nice and smooth, it was time to draw the profile of the blade on them. After that, I cut the excess metal off the scale using the bandsaw, and then grinded the pieces down to match the shape of the knife. Once they were ready, I used a center punch for a guide on where to drill the holes on the handles. Then moved over to the drill press and drill some holes. Now it was time for a rough assembly of the knife to see how everything is gonna fit. So far so good. While I had the pins in, I really ground down the handles to an almost final shape and thickness. Because of the grit I used on the grinder, it left deep horizontal grind marks on the handles. Now it was time for a lot of hand sanding. I used 320 grit paper to really make the grind lines disappear and give it that MAC brushed aluminum look. After about an hour of sanding, you can see the difference. Now I had to figure out how to include the screws on the handle. After a while, it hit me.
Aha!
I would grind down the screws just so I had the top of the screw to act like a cap. I did this by putting them in a pair of pliers and gently applying pressure on my grinder.
One of these things is not like the others. One of these things doesn't belong.
Then countersunk the holes on the handle so the screws would sit flush. Ooh, that's flush. Now I would glue them in the holes using 5-minute epoxy. Just remember to move fast because it literally is 5-minute epoxy. Once I did that, I let it sit for a few hours, and now it was time to glue the rest of the handle together using more epoxy. When gluing up a knife handle, I always like to put out anything I might need, such as rubbing alcohol and paper towels. Always remember, it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. Next, I clamped it up and then used some rubbing alcohol to wipe down any excess epoxy that may have dripped out. So I let it sit overnight, and when it was time to take the clamps off, I noticed some epoxy that leaked on the handle. So I lightly went over it on the grinder with some high grit belts to take it off. Next, I used some 320 grit sandpaper to round the corners of the handles to take off any sharp edges that might feel uncomfortable in the hand. Once that was done, it was finally ready to be sharpened. I really like the Lansky sharpening system. I think it gives you the sharpest, most precise edge out of all the ways to sharpen a knife. First, you start by choosing what angle you want your secondary bevel to be. Then you start from the most coarse stone to the highest grit stone, flipping it over after each time, checking the burr on the edge of the blade with your fingernail. And let me tell you, this process is not a quick one. This blade took about 45 minutes to work through each stone, ending up on the highest grit stone, which is this yellow one. Finally, it was time to strop the blade to make it razor sharp. A few passes on my electric leather strop definitely did the trick. There it is, a finished blade. And now it's ready to cut some paper.
It will cut.
It goes through paper like a hot knife through paper. Never mind. Take my word, it's wicked sharp. So here it is, it's done, it's finished, and I'm calling it Mac the Knife. Like the song that was in the beginning of the never mind. It was a really fun build. I learned a ton. Up to this point, I've made about 15 knives, but I can really say with this build, I learned a ton more about knife grinding, heat treating, and actually making my own scales, which is pretty cool. So that's it. So if you like this video, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit the little bell notification every time you want to get notified when I make a new video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.